In Daniel chapter 4, we have this kind of an interesting piece to have included in Daniel's story and what's going on with it. Okay, so this is a continuation, really, of what happens in chapter 2, 3. So 2, 3, and 4 kind of all together. Chapter 1 leads into it. So in chapter 1, you have Daniel and his friends being taken into Babylon, and they are they're put in a situation where they're supposed to be learning for the king to become. They're being groomed to go into positions of leadership, to have positions of authority in the kingdom. And in that, they were told they're going to eat from the king's table, and they asked if they would be granted the opportunity to eat vegetables. And basically, what they're asking, we want to stay within the dietary restrictions of what God would be able to be approved of, right? So for them, the safest way was just to eat this vegetarian. And our dietitian pointed out to us that this was the first test group, right? I mean, you had a test and a theory, or you had a theory and a test, and it was proven. So God's hand involved there. I love that. So then in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar finds out about David's ability to interpret dreams, and he's able to go in and tell the king his dream and interpret it. In chapter 3, we have this great powerful, the great power of God revealed with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They would not bow down to the statue that had been set up, and everybody was supposed to worship. They don't do that. Thrown into the fiery furnace, of course, and they're surviving. And so we see in all of those things how God has challenged us, I think, and how we were supposed to respond and how that works out. So what I was saying last week in particular, the response of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is that we will never bow down to your statue because we believe our God can save us from your fiery furnace. But if he doesn't, it still doesn't matter. We're not going to bow down. So tonight, we're going to have another story about King Nebuchadnezzar and how he interacts with Daniel and what God tries to prove to him. And I find it interesting because this is told from King Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. This is going to be from the king and his writing about what has happened and how he came to this point. So I find that absolutely striking that what we include in our Bible is this word of testimony, really. This is a testimony of King Nebuchadnezzar, this very pagan king, and how this interaction happened for him, right? And so what you're going to find is that this is his letter. So we start out in Daniel chapter 4, and it says, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth. May your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and the wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. So that sounds really very much in line with kind of how we ended last week, where, Nebuchadnezzar has seen God providing for these three men, and he declares God's praises there. And so we start out kind of in that same sort of, at least, thought that everybody everywhere should hear this. God is the Most High, and he's declaring his praises. And sings this great benediction, or not benediction, but doxology to him. And he says, how great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is everlasting, and his dominion is from generation to generation. That sound about right to y'all? Yeah, that's right on track. It did not get there in an easy way, though. So if you read the chapter, you already know. Right? So, in verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. So, when we talk about fancy language, what's he saying kind of in just a simple way?
Everything's going fine.
Everything is going fine. Yeah, this is, I don't know how it is to be king of anything, obviously. But, you got to think that when you're in this position, that if you can say things like, I was at ease in my house and everything is flourishing. That's exactly what you want as king. And this was true. When we look historically at Nebuchadnezzar as a king, a Babylonian king, he was very successful. We know that he had gone through Jerusalem and had conquered all of Judea, but then he goes on down into Egypt, and so we have that big map of him basically controlling everything that we've kind of been fighting for over the last several years. So we're talking from the very tip of Africa, so to speak, that far northeastern part, from Egypt all the way up through Israel, part of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, all of these countries that are multiple countries now. He controlled all of that. That was his kingdom. It was massive, and he was had been very successful in that. So he truly was flourishing. By historical, worldly standards, we could say, yeah, he was successful in what he was trying to accomplish, right? So, in verse 5, though, it says, I saw, again, so this is Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. I saw this. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. All right, so, again, Nebuchadnezzar's having a dream, very much like chapter 2. We're back to this point where he's seeing things, and I think, again, like we had in chapter 2, God has given this to him. So he's allowed to have this dream and have a vision about what's going to happen. Now, it says it troubled him. He's just about to ask for everybody to come in and give him an interpretation. However, when it says it was troubling him, do you think that he had an idea of what it meant? If he didn't have any clue, it probably wouldn't trouble you. I think Nebuchadnezzar, I've said this before, we're going to see it again tonight, in a lot of things, Nebuchadnezzar was very smart. And I think Nebuchadnezzar asks for interpretation, but I don't know that he really needed much interpretation of this dream that we're about to read. I think he figured it out already, and it bothered him, because where it was taking him was not good. So he starts asking for people to come in. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that I might make known the interpretation. So again, we have all these same people, the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in. I related the dream to them, so it's a little different than the first when he tells them a dream. But they could not make an interpretation known to me. Finally, Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. This is interesting here. Lewis had asked a question last week about the capitalizing of God and gods and that kind of stuff. And I think they're doing it right here. Because he asks Daniel to come in, and he notes that he goes by the name Belteshazzar, which is a name according to his God, but that the name that Daniel goes by is actually the name of is the spirit of the holy gods. Okay, but it's plural. So Nebuchadnezzar always had troubles because his mind had always worked in this world of that there's a bunch of gods out there, and that the world revolves around kind of whims of these gods, and you try to please them, and if you please them, then things can go well for you. And so I think he always struggled with this idea that there was only one God. I kind of have to ask the question, after we had chapter 2, whom Nebuchadnezzar had brought in all of the other guys, right? We have that same list, magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans. Why did he go back to those guys? Are you asking that same question, Will?
Well, I was actually going to ask that question, but I usually answer. If you usually answer someone ask. So yeah, why did he go back to those people, even though they messed up the first time? You know, 'cause Daniel vouched for him. That's why they got to live. And so,
Yeah, all of them would have been dead if it weren't for Daniel
Right.
at this point, right?
He wanted a different answer than what he already knew.
Okay. So JJ's response was that I think Nebuchadnezzar was looking for a different response than the one that he knew about. And that goes in line with what I was saying. I think Nebuchadnezzar already knows the answer to this dream, and he's hoping it's something else. So in my personal opinion, and this is just an opinion on this one because I don't have a clear answer to be honest with you. I think Nebuchadnezzar asks for all those other guys because he's hoping they're going to give him something different.
That he could maybe live with.
Yeah, an answer that would be a little more suitable to him. What do you think, Nick? What do you think, Lewis? Why do you?
I just think it's Nebuchadnezzar probably thought that these different people will serve different gods.
Okay.
And so, if this God put that dream in there, then this person specializing in that God could be able to answer that.
Okay, and that goes along the lines of his understanding of the world of the pantheon of these gods. And I think that definitely is something that's going on in his mind because he is always operating in this world that there is all these gods. So what if somebody else sent in or one of these other gods sent him a vision? So yeah, I think that's a great answer too to what may be going on. And quite honestly, I probably think a lot of these things are also going on. And so one other one that I think kind of goes hand in hand with what Lewis was saying, the idea of a single God was just nearly impossible for these people to grasp and to hold on to. So I think that one of the other reasons is that even though Daniel had been the one to reveal, and God had shown his great power, even though Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had saved by this God and they'd seen his great power, it was just way too much for Nebuchadnezzar to turn loose of what he had always known. And these advisors were the group that they turned to, and they led these conjurers, magicians, Chaldeans. They would have also been the people that would have led worship of these false gods. And so he would have been very much more comfortable with them in general. And isn't it funny, but isn't this what we do? Don't you like to go to the people that you're the most comfortable with for answers? Sometimes that's good. If we have surrounded ourselves with good people who will give us honest and truthful answers, that will be compassionate with us when we have chosen bad things and are trying to help us. But I work in a world in the criminal justice system of people who surround themselves with folks that choose all the wrong things. And they would listen to them much sooner than they would listen to me or JJ in probation about what might be a better choice, because they're used to that group. They like that group. They're familiar with that group. And they encourage each other to do things that they want to do.
That group of people, they liked their lifestyle with the king, and so they were going to pursue him and not give up on him because they liked being around him.
Yeah.
That lifestyle.
So yeah, there's a connectedness that we will be supportive of you because you support us. To quote Bugs Bunny, one of my favorites, in one of the cartoons, he's featured as being a support cast to a famous wrestler and who was getting beat up. And so Bugs Bunny jumps in because he says, "Oh, brother, there goes my bread and butter." So, but it's not a joke, it's a real quote. Look it up. But these guys they have a vested interest, so they want him to do well, right? So interestingly though, all the folks come in, they don't press to try to say, well, we've got the answer for you. Daniel finally does come in, and he listens to it. So verse 8 said, "So finally Daniel came before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to my God, and in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream which I have seen, along with its interpretation. Okay, so recognizes Daniel for being special amongst his magicians and wise men. But note that he calls him a chief of the magicians. So he still doesn't quite have a handle on who and what God is. Now these were the visions of my mind as I lay in my bed, and I was looking, behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. And the tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant. It was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all the living creatures fed themselves from it. And I was looking in the visions, and in my mind, as I lay in my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted and spoke as follows: chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds of the branches, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it. As the new grass of the field, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him share with the beasts in the grass of the earth, and his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers. The decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows on it whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. Okay, so the vision that he has is, if you've got the picture, right? Big giant tree, and as it opens up, the tree is beautiful. Everybody in the whole world can see it, and it's got food, and it's got shelter, and it provides for everything that's around it, right? But then the judgment comes upon it, and it says the sentence, and they mean like a judgment, the sentencing phase. So the sentence comes down, it's going to be cut down to the ground, and it's going to be bound with iron. And it's going to have 7 periods of time, is what mine said. They did ask me about that one. It's a difficult kind of word to translate. It can be years. Periods is probably the more correct, but it would have been kind of that deal of transitioning between Jewish calendars and non-Jewish calendars, because they operated differently. But either way, I think there's kind of also the explanation that some of this is going to be up to Nebuchadnezzar. There'll be 7 periods that pass, and this looks like 7 years in the way this falls out. But I think it has been left open because it's kind of up to Nebuchadnezzar how long it's going to actually take. And so I think it leaves some room there as well. But one of the key things is that his mind's going to be taken away. He's going to have the mind of a beast. And so he's about to be transformed. Okay? So verse 18, he says, this is the dream. Can you give me the interpretation? All right, so now we switch. We're going to start moving from the first person over to Daniel. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was appalled for a while as his thoughts alarmed him. The king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. So, as he's explaining this, Daniel does indeed understand what he's saying. And like I said, I think also Nebuchadnezzar knows what he's about to tell him. And so he says, just tell me what it means. And so he answers, my Lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you, and its interpretation your adversaries. So Daniel's gracious to King Nebuchadnezzar. He's been taken away from his home. He's been kept basically as a prisoner, although he now has been elevated to this high job, but he still recognizes that the king that he's standing in front of was there because God put him there. And so he treats him kindly. Verse 20, the tree that you saw, which became large and grew strong, whose height reached the sky, and was visible to all the earth, and to those, whose foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and its food for all, and under which the beasts of the field dwell, all that. He says, you, O king, have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. Right? So, yeah. John.
I don't want to get you off track here. Come back where you left off. But I want to go back to verse 17, which answers the question that every generation has. And this question is asked in America. Half of America asked the question, why did Donald Trump become president? Half of America asked, why in the world did Barack Obama become president? Our forefathers asked that same question about whoever the leaders were. My parents didn't like Harry Truman. And they didn't understand, why would he become president? People don't understand, why did Hitler become a leader in Germany? Verse 17 gives the answer. Every person that comes to a position of leadership is there because of the sovereignty of God, and God is the one that allows that person or puts that person into the position. Now, that makes us feel uncomfortable. Let me read verse 17 again. The decision is announced by the messengers, the holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets them over the lowest of men. Men become president or king or prime minister of a country, and we don't understand why. Oh, just let us yield ourselves to the sovereignty of God and say, okay, God, I'm going to be an obedient citizen. I'm going to vote and do my part, but it is God who makes the most important decisions concerning the leadership of the world, and we need to give place to God's sovereign will.
And there you go. That's the lesson.
Yeah, God called Nebuchadnezzar his servant.
Yeah, he was. That's the whole point. Nebuchadnezzar's mind is going to be taken away because he's not going to recognize God. And that's really the whole point of the lesson, is that God places people where they place them. And that's, I mean, the whole rest of this is based on that. I mean, that's the lesson in this whole thing is that this leader himself doesn't recognize that.
Well, that's true.
And that's the difference. So it's all great and wonderful to say that God places those people in those places, and I totally agree with that. But if the leader doesn't recognize that God placed him in that, then they're going to end up just like Nebuchadnezzar. Right? So the point is to say that God has placed us here, and that judgment comes down. And so as Daniel is giving this interpretation, he is going to say to Nebuchadnezzar that you have to acknowledge God. And so a year later, he doesn't. He says, look what I've done. And immediately, all sense is taken from him. And he goes to graze in the fields. Right?
You wouldn't want to use this to try to convert someone.
Well, this is not a happy But this is, I mean, the point of the tale is to try to get people to understand that it's God's sovereignty that matters. Nothing else. In the New Testament, Jesus says that the Gentile rulers lord it over them, right? So it's all nice and good, John, to say that God puts those people in those places. But if that leader doesn't recognize God, then they will then lead you into horrible things. And I'm not saying that any of our leaders did, or that they will, or that they won't. God will put them there. But even for Nebuchadnezzar, who was God's instrument to punish his people, he still had the need to acknowledge where power came from. Yeah, Jim.
That's fine for kings and rulers and all of that. But I've been asked many, many times, how do I know what my purpose is in life? Did God also put us here for a special time or a special purpose?
So in reading the story, Nebuchadnezzar, let me get your answer. I want to answer Jim's question. In Nebuchadnezzar's story, we wait 7 years, and it says he lifts his eyes to the heaven. Now, when we run across that in the Bible, when they lift their eyes to the heaven, what do they typically? It's a euphemism, okay? It's a euphemism for what, though, in this situation? I used $5 words. I got that. What when we say they lifted their eyes? What do they say? What?
Yes, to God.
Yeah. It's praying to God. It's worshiping God. We can put a lot of categories in there, but in all of it, it's recognizing God. So what is our purpose? Oftentimes that answer has been to worship God. And if we look at that and we say, what does it mean to worship God? It's a pretty good answer. It's probably the best answer we get, because what is true worship? What the Bible? Tell me something. Okay, that's true, heart-minded soul. But when we talk about what is true worship in the New Testament, what do they say we do?
Sacrifice our body to them.
Okay, sacrifice our bodies. What else? Care for the widows and the orphans, right? It's about caring for other people. It's about worshiping God. It's about giving our whole self to God, right? So he lifts up his eyes, and finally Nebuchadnezzar comes back to his right mind, and his kingdom is restored to him. And so he gets that back. We read the story of Job. Jim taught on that not too long ago. It seems like not long ago. I don't know. It seems fairly recent, right? And so in Job's story, Job is challenged, and he feels like God's putting upon him, and then he's asked, well, where were you when I was doing all the creative work? And Job realizes, well, I was not even thought of. So finding our rightful place with God and worship puts us in that mindset, right?
Yeah, and another point to make there is, we also need to recognize the sovereignty of God in our lives.
Yep. Everybody. Yeah. Very few of us are going to serve as president. I know I won't, because you have to, sign a thing that says I want to run. I've been in politics for the last couple of years, not directly, but I work for politicians, and I don't want that world, I promise you. I cannot imagine being president of the United States. I think it's got to be horrible. I was watching today, Donald Trump has been pretty agitated. His speeches recently show a lot of frustration and anger. I don't know that he knew what he signed up for when he started running for president. I think it's extremely hard to be in that position. I think it was even for Nebuchadnezzar. His problem was not that he was being successful, that he was doing all these things. None of that was wrong. His problem was he didn't acknowledge that God was the one behind it and not himself. So, John's point, well taken, about God places governments in people. But the reality is that if you don't acknowledge God as being the source of all that, it won't necessarily go well for you. Does that complement the point, John? Is that, yeah?
I'm amazed at how patient God is with Nebuchadnezzar, because he keeps going around in a circle. He recognizes that what's been done, and God is the Almighty God, and you're the only God, and then he gets all full of himself again, and he has to learn it again. That's the way we all do that.
I'm glad he's patient, because that means he's patient with me too.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Yeah, so it's an interesting cycle that we have with Nebuchadnezzar because of that. And so this completes really the cycle we're going to have with him through Daniel and how he interacts with him. It leaves us with Nebuchadnezzar offering this genuine testimony. I think this is a genuine testimony of somebody whose heart was broken and who understood because he's the one that writes his letter. It says, I, Nebuchadnezzar. And that time period, those 7 years, can you imagine how humiliating that would be? You know, to be out there, like John said, you're out munching on grass and dandelions,
I mean, that doesn't bother me as much as the losing my mind part.
right? If you've ever lost your mind, and I have, it's unfortunate, right? I mean, it's that deal when you're trying to gain it back. You know, it is.
She's married already.
I know, right?
No, you're saying that about the wrong person. Correct analogy, wrong person.
Say,
Yeah,
do you realize that when something like that happens, when you lose your mind, do you realize you lost it, or do you just go with the flow?
No, you thought we was all wrong.
That's right.
So you realize at the very end?
I think, yeah. I mean, truly, it's that deal where, you know, when you're having real struggles, when I've dealt with people who've been truly struggling with mental health, where they have really lost touch with reality, they don't know. They don't know. You saw them in the prison, Lewis. I know you saw them. Those people that they didn't understand what real was anymore. They're so out of touch with reality, they can't understand that there is a reality out there. It's very, very real for some of those folks. Yes, ma'am.
Did his kingdom know that Nebuchadnezzar was an animal grazing in the pastures?
Yeah, from what we gather, it didn't ever talk about what the people thought of him, because this was being told from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. And it just says that he was out in the fields grazing. But you gather that, that people saw what was going on with him. And that's why I say it must have been, once he comes back to himself and he realizes the kind of person he's been, I mean, it had to be very humbling, right? Extremely humbling. Any other thoughts on it? Well, I think the great point of the lesson is that God is in control of all of these things. And so John's point about God placing people in their positions is key. And then I think the other point is that we all then have to recognize that in that when you're put in that position of being in charge, I mean, even if we're talking about, you know, at the lowest level, you're in charge of a team or a squad or whatever it is. I mean, and then all the way up to being president of the United States or wherever, right? It's still vital that we recognize that God is the one that's behind all of that. Because if you don't do that, then it's pointless. And that's for everything in our lives. If we can't acknowledge that God's present in our lives, we don't acknowledge that He's doing those things for us. And maybe my one protection, honestly, is I also hear some people kind of take that maybe one step too far, is that God directs everything you do. And see, that's also not true. That takes away our ability to be who we are. So what I'm saying is God's placed you where you are. He's gifted you. He's provided for you and all these things, and we acknowledge that. I don't think that Nebuchadnezzar would have been wrong if he would say, Lord, thank you for letting me do these things. You know, God, if he acknowledges where God's at in that, then that changes his perspective, right? All right. Well, I appreciate y'all's time in class. Lots of good discussion tonight, so I appreciate that. And, we will take up chapter 5 next week and move away from Nebuchadnezzar, and they'll start quickly into Daniel's own visions and dreams. So, if you would, let's close with prayer. Father God, we do thank you for your blessings, and we thank you for the ways that you provide for us and where you've put us and how we might be able to serve. I pray, Father, that we would be a blessing to those around us because we do acknowledge you, and that we would be that light in a dark world, that we will acknowledge your provision and how you work in our lives. And pray, Father, that we would bring your presence into all that we do. Help us, Father, to be those that acknowledge you in what we do. And we thank you, Father, for what you do provide for us. And so we ask that you would be with our leaders of this nation and all these nations in the world, that peace would find its place, and that we might be able to have opportunity to spend more time studying the Bible and not fighting wars. Thank you, Father, for your love, and pray for your continued forgiveness. In Jesus' name.